Perfect. Let me just queue up our next one, which is Alan Phelan, whose talk is Our Kind, Roger Casement's Speculative Life in Norway. And Alan is a Dublin-born artist who works across sculpture, photography, film, museum interventions, public art, and collaborations with other artists, writers, and curators. Right, Alan.
Again, thanks so much for the invitation to be able to speak here today and I guess reflect on this film that I made in 2016. It has a lot of parallels with what Jackie went through and her thought processes as well. So there's a little bit different, but a little bit the same as well. It's been really good to kind of revisit some of my original research and rationale and thinking behind it. I combined a lot of different sources, which again have a different end result and a different logic to academia or writing an academic paper. I think artists have that lovely luxury of being able to break rules to get towards different types of meaning and different types of understandings. So I'll show you a trailer hopefully in a few minutes, but just I just want to go through, is it this button? My rationale first. So the film was set in 1941. It's a counterfactual approach to history. Counterfactual is different from a historical fiction. It's a different way of describing fiction. Generally, it's the manipulation of truth by using facts to tell lies. I first heard it from Geoffrey Dungeon, who's the Belfast gay unionist historian and decoder of Casement's Black Diaries. He has published a large volume in several editions now, which is, for many people, including myself, like one of the best sources in understanding Roger Casement. In Northern politics, both sides really have long accused each other of using counterfactual narratives. And it's even more apt now, I think, in these post-truth times that we live through. You can't really believe the news in terms of what it's coming from or whose position and who's in charge and all the rest of it. Anyway, the dictionary calls counterfactual what has not happened or is not what is the case. Sorry. And I developed this further into another kind of word salad called counterfactual temporalities. And this was drawing on the theoretical writing by Ariella Aisha Azoulay, who's a Palestinian photography theorist and philosopher, I suppose, who's written about unlearning imperialism and imagining other potential histories. Temporalities allowed for me, I guess, and it does as a word, it allows for these incursions into science fiction in some respects. And there is a lineage there from H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, that becomes speculative fiction as the science fiction genre emerges through other writers like Huxley and Orwell and Ursula Le Guin. These writers weren't all about sort of alien invasions. They also kind of really explored the structures of society and governance and technology and freedom. So that's sort of where I kind of parse into this idea of temporalities. Photography and film theory, anyway, have kind of run their course really with the binaries of fact versus fiction. So I was kind of looking for a gray area in between that allowed for something else to be said. And it kind of allows for, I guess, this queer space to emerge and approaching history to untangle it, but then also retangle it and recomplicate it. Because history is never really very simple and it's never really told by one person, or it shouldn't be. So this has been something that I've been interested in really since my grad MFA work, where I placed Egon Schiele in the 90s when I did that, in Ireland, looking for these sexy homonyms of the Schiele-Negig, because the Egon Schiele thing, it was this ridiculous sort of art history that kind of related to primitivism in early modern art and stuff, but also that kind of continues into my more recent work with John Joly's color photography process and his speculative relationship with Henry Horatio Dixon in the film Foley and Diction. So my film is set in 1941, 25 years after his execution, but why? That's not, I'm going the wrong way. Right? No, it's not. Yeah, it's after the next slide, but the slide's missing. Oops. That's okay. Something almost happened there. Yeah, but anyway, so the project was originally called Casement in Exile. De Valera's Ireland really wouldn't have been very welcoming and would have been actively hostile towards a public gay couple. I think these other couples that Sean mentioned stuff were a decade later. So rural Norway offered a kind of refuge. These panels that I'm going to show you that are the visuals for the talk are taken, they're little quotes from Casement's execution speech on his trial for high treason from the dock. It's a very iconic legal speech, much loved by many, many barristers. And I use small quotes in between. It shifts the context for me and for the story quite a bit, and it's a little bit disruptive, but it also kind of brings it back to Casement. But it's obviously out of context. The text is amazing. If you ever get a chance to root it out, it's online everywhere. So anyway, just briefly to explain who Roger Casement was, for those of you who don't know everything about him or are not totally familiar with it, he was one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, knighted for exposing atrocities on the rubber plantations in the Congo and Peru, later executed as a traitor, later in that he was executed later in the year, not around the same time as the other 1916 leaders. It was later in November that same year. He was caught landing arms in Kerry, arrested, and brought to the Tower of London, all very dramatic. He had a broad public support, however, until the British, until his private diaries were released to the public, and that meant that they detailed his homosexual activities, and after that, support just fell away. These diaries have been disputed for many years as forgeries, and really they were just the result of an obsessive bureaucrat who kept multiple diaries and wrote up a lot about everything. He was a civil servant and he had lots of reports to write, so he kept multiple diaries. It wasn't unusual at the time, but nevertheless, this destroyed his reputation. And in explaining how Casement's reputation needed to be destroyed, comparatively, you've got to think of somebody like Bob Geldof and his great white savior humanitarian work, and how you would possibly try him for treason and execute him. It's very, very difficult to destroy somebody who's much loved and who has done such great work. And equally with Casement, something really, really horrible had to happen to him for his reputation to be destroyed because he was knighted, etc., etc. So revealing the fact that he was homosexual is what did it. So Brian Lewis, who's a British academic, details many of the, backtrack a bit. So as I researched into Casement, reading many texts around his histories, what became really apparent was that historians, politicians, columnists, popular history writers all had a problem with Casement's sexuality, with him being gay, and moreover disputed the diaries. And there's a vast amount of writing about him. Brian Lewis, who's a British academic, details many of these relatively recent dissenters in a really excellent essay called The Queer Life and Afterlife of Roger Casement, which is published in the Journal of the History of Sexuality in October in 2005. So he details people like Ulick O'Connor, who called Casement a dangerous and degenerate monster. Other government advisors, especially one who's just recently deceased, so I won't name him, spoke at an RIA conference in 2000, saying that Casement had inspired Irish foreign policy, but the diarist was a conscienceless predator. John Bruton, our former Taoiseach Prime Minister, dismissed Casement's private life in reviewing Dungeon's book, saying that these diaries have no literary and now no little historical value, and should not have been given so much space in an otherwise stimulating, fair and well-written book. Other sort of political writers like Ruth Dudley Edwards, Conor Cruise O'Brien, unsurprisingly had issues with his sexuality, and even popular journalists like Vincent Brown has long peddled a kind of story of paedophilia around Roger Casement in the Irish Independent. But it's one particular writer who I focused on in some of my research called Angus Mitchell, who claimed that the diaries were in fact homophobic documents. So this, rather than evidence of a homosexual nationalist, he claims that the diaries paint homosexuality as a sickness leading to guilt, repression, fantasy, hatred, alienation, and loneliness inside a world of alienated, corrupt, marginality, bereft of real emotion. So, definitely not allowing any kind of sexual identity be part of this great nationalist hero. This kind of preposterous Trumpian twist I described in a lot of the press around the film as an inverted homophobia, where they're using us against ourselves in some bizarre kind of twist. I didn't, and there's a lot of squabbles between historians. Angus Mitchell and Jeffrey Dungeon don't get on. There was this kind of minor fight at the opening in the Hugh Lane, which was kind of, unsurprising and a bit ridiculous, but I never really wanted to get involved in an academic historical squabble. It's pretty typical across all academia. People have different opinions and they kind of forge their careers on one side of the fence or the other. I also work as an archivist, and so I'm actually kind of aware of how history is constructed and the research that I provide for people to help construct narratives around particular historical issues. So I was really more interested in presenting other speculative ideas rather than resolving a very complex narrative. Now I'm going to show the trailer very, very quickly. So it's just a less than 3 minute trailer that just shows you something. Sorry.
This one.
There. Look. Look.
The choreography of the coincidence is perfect. It's got cold. Bitterly cold.
We'll have snow very soon.
Imagine what has happened.
Haven't you read the newspapers? You want to drive me mad as well?
It was an accident.
Just a stupid little accident, I suppose. But I was innocent. Because of the detraction of an unknown, I got closer to this woman. So you see, you can be wrong.
So, as you saw, so the film opens up with a bedroom scene of Roger and Adler Christensen, his Norwegian assistant and lover, manservant, valet, unemployed sailor, rent boy, and con man, who accompanied Casement from New York to Germany, fundraising for the Rising and seeking out Irish prisoners of war in German camps to serve if released by the Germans. In my version, they disembark in Oslo and end up in rural Norway. There, Alice Stopford Green visits. She had worked with Casement on the Congo Reform Association, which had kind of revealed the King Leopold's atrocities in the rubber plantations there. I later met a Norwegian historian, Bjorn Godoy, who wrote about Adler in a book called Double Game, Double Split, Spill in Norwegian. It's only in Norwegian, it hasn't had an English translation yet, but in that he revealed how Casement had been betrayed twice to the British by Adler for money, for a reward, but he in fact had fed them counterintelligence. And so there's this amazing story that has never been told about Casement and Adler and how they had created this situation of bringing the British fleet to the Baltic Sea to be destroyed by the Germans. It all got uncovered, it never happened, and the story disappeared with it, but there's an amazing film there with Bjorn was like, if you can get Michael Fassbender, I'll find oil money and we can make this film. And didn't get that far with it. It would be a great thing to do, but I just didn't want to pursue it. It's beyond me. Adler himself died in prison a decade later, actually, for check fraud. And this was after also fathering several children through several other women. And again, there's another movie there as well about his very, very peculiar twisted. Casement had met him as a rent boy in Times Square originally, and then hooked up with him again when he went back for the fundraising thing. So it was all, but he was more of a burden on the trip because he was a bit of a fancy man, apparently. People didn't like him, didn't take the Casement because of his well-dressed companion. Anyway, in my version of the story, Adler joins the Nazis in Quisling's Norway after a fling with Alice, again, totally speculative, and then Casement kind of ends the film with this kind of puzzling story about a love triangle. The film uses sort of characterization really and a collage rather than any kind of real historical biography. And ironically, this whole phrase about dishonorable fantasy was also used by Angus Mitchell in a text where he completely destroys and interrogates all of his critics who are supportive of the diaries being real and not forged. They were forensically verified as being real, but he discounts all that, and it's quite a scurrilous academic paper. It's published in the Field Day Review in 2012, actually. So the film is not a celebration of a failed homosexual or even a saintly hagiography. There is no Saint Roger that emerges in the end. In fact, he talks about a man cheating on a woman in the film, someone he was possibly involved with, the man, but possibly also the woman, so it kind of complicates his sexuality as well. Casement is, in fact, super contradictory. He's both a Protestant and a Catholic. He was from Dublin, but also from Antrim. He was a British civil servant and an Irish nationalist hero. He was gay, but several writers really kind of try to find women that he had relationships with, or to say that he was attracted to women and was sort of at least flirting with them. And it's pretty much kind of wishful thinking. He was this handsome, bearded hipster, nevertheless, of course. Anyway, the trailer you just saw is pretty punchy, but it doesn't really represent the film terribly well. It's a trailer to, entice people to go to the thing, so it kind of gives a lot away in some respects. The film itself is much slower, it's much more confusing, it's quite theatrical. The camera never really moves, the scenes are staged like this 1940s melodrama. The characters are trapped within this still kind of frame where they perform. Alice has this 5-minute walk at the beginning of the film, which is really quite excruciating because it just goes on and on and on. It's sort of her traipsing through lots and lots of landscape. The dialogue itself is also quite mangled and it's hard to follow. And that awkwardness is deliberate. It's a way of embodying this choreography of the coincidence that Alice says on the trailer, which is one of the key kind of phrases pointing towards the construction of the story and the construction of the history that I'm presenting. Casement, nevertheless, he does remain one of the most written about 1916 leaders. There's so many books about him. But my aim was not to simplify his complex story, but present another one. And making the film about a broken relationship may seem odd just after the marriage equality vote, but I had really wanted to ensure that there was a queer presence for Casement within 2016, and a queer acknowledgement of Casement within state commemorations and state funding, which I did secure, thankfully. Otherwise, his memory and discussions about Casement was largely ignored by the official apparatus, but there were two other projects, one in Emma by Simon Fujiwara, and another one on Bannistrand, a dance project by Fergus O'Concourt. Both had speculative, queer approaches. One, a bombastic audio from a trailer for a film that was never made, which was Simon Fujiwara's piece. Casement movies have a long history of failing, and he found this really interesting. There was a script that was encouraged and funded by Eamon de Valera at one point that just canned, that was heading towards towards Hollywood, and it just never happened. And several other attempts. I think there's a Neil Jordan movie in the works or something, but maybe not. I didn't want to make a Michael Collins historical narrative and drama with all the flaws that you have around that, because they always sort of fail in lots of different ways anyway in trying to represent complex characters in that movie moment. So all three of us a reimagined Casement beyond these official histories. And I guess, back to marriage equality, the struggle is never really ending, right? Other people have said this today. Rights can be rolled back. They are in the US currently. Casement was at the beginning of a humanitarian movement. A lot of the research and historians like to focus on that. Angus Mitchell especially focuses on the humanitarian side and how the gay stuff is just irrelevant. But for many, it is actually super important in understanding how Casement saw the world. How he understood things. So briefly, writing has always been difficult for me, especially script writing. I'm from a photography world, from sculpture world. Entering into the movie business is always difficult. I always get given out to by crew members for not doing things right, but I still have to pretend to be this director. The way I write was influenced by this British writer called Tony White. He's introduced me to this notion of re-narrativizing, where found texts are merged, or moreover, remodulated into different stories. Tony also uses a bunch of different constrained writing techniques as a novelist that really helped me then assemble things and assemble funny sources or odd sources into one other different a whole. He had written about my work for a catalogue for an Emma show in 2009. That's how I got introduced to him. But moreover, it's what gave me this license then was understanding also how cinema works and the whole mise-en-scène, working with lighting and score and the performance of the actors, and how you can subvert or disrupt using these elements. So I had this amazing lighting cameraman who's an Italian guy called Luca Roccini, who was trained in Dun Laoghaire, who was able to create these 1940s scenes with a bulb and lots of scrims and screens. It's all very, very low budget, obviously. I worked with Wendy Judge on costumes and props, who's a visual artist. Michael Fleming, who works a lot in TV, is the composer of the music. Again, he scored it afterwards, scoring to the edits that I had made brilliantly in terms of creating a more somber, but respectful, slow pacing to the film. And then Gina Moxley, who plays Alice Stopford Green, is an actor who I've worked with a few different projects, but she's brilliant on that dramaturge business, that way of turning things into a dramatic script, and also works with a lot of untraditional, non-traditional texts in creating theatre. I also worked from subtitles, the English subtitles to a German film, which complicated things. The German film that the dialogue comes from, and the structure of the film actually comes from, is this very obscure 1985 Michael Haneke made-for-TV movie called Wer war Edgar Allan, which is about a art student in Venice who takes lots of drugs and he kills his drug dealer. Now, it's a very completely unrelated, there's no parallels to Casement, but within that I found that there were. I found there were three aspects of the story that kind of triggered something about Casement's betrayal. The big thing about Casement is that he was betrayed by everybody, he was let down by everybody. So these moments of betrayal are depicted in the film, where Adler has an affair with Alice, then where Adler joins the Nazis, betraying his kind of political standpoints of Casement, and then Casement talks about this memory of a lost love. Counterfactual and speculative approaches provide a way into and around the pains of Irish history, really. Geoffrey Dungeon and Brian Lewis were key texts for me, and meeting Geoffrey in Belfast was really important in understanding his position and how alien he even finds the Republic. He's an immensely complicated person as well. I was kind of really grateful he came down to Dublin alone. It was such a big deal for a Belfast unionist to come to Dublin for an opening about Casement. He kind of doesn't do that very often, and it was very, very uncomfortable. He didn't really like the film, and Angus didn't like it either, and I had kind of squabbles with him in the night. And I'm kind of happy to be unsatisfied. I mean, unsatisfying to these historians, that I didn't fulfill the historical gaps that they fill in their own kind of way of writing the history, because as historians, what they do when there isn't evidence, they just fill in those gaps. And a lot of it is completely speculative. It's just that I was twisting it back into kind of a queer speculative space. Geoffrey Dungeon, in case you don't know, is the David Norris of Northern Ireland. He was responsible for decriminalizing homosexuality before we did it in the South. So he's kind of a super champion as well. I'm just going to end with some quotes from Lewis in terms of understanding Casement. Lewis writes that Casement's restless pursuit of casual sex is human and understandable and far from perverse, but it's scarcely heroic. Casement did not fight for gay rights, but lived as a complex and flawed man. So Lewis has argued that historians should avoid bleaching figures into bland objectivity, better to present them in their full humanity. W.G. Sebald, in his Rings of Saturn novel book, has echoed this, and noting that Casement's homosexuality sensitized him to the oppression across race and class. And that's how he kind of flipped sides and changed sides from British into Irish nationalism. History is not a simple sequence of events, but a construct needing interrogation constantly. The film ends with Casement looking through a book that he picked up off the side of the room of a bookcase, and it's sort of implied that it's a diary because he's sort of fondly flicking through it and remembering something. This is after he has kicked Adler out of the house and ended the relationship. It seemed to be apt to use, so the text here, I should be reading it, is where I got the title for the film. One more slide. I'm out of sequence here, sorry. So this is him flicking through the book. And it's where I got the title for the film, and it's often kind of misinterpreted as a place where Casement is talking about his gay brotherhood in some way, but it's actually he's talking about the Irish instead. So it seemed like that point of confusion and misrepresentation or misunderstanding was a really good thing to use for the title of the film, because you can't be wrong, basically. Thank you.